Hello, everyone. This is Eve, and the podcast is just about to start. But I wanted to jump on here really quick first because there's a few things to say about this episode that feel really important to me today, so we're adding it on at the last minute. I am about to play an episode that records this fantastic time that I had with David Barry, a fertility fraud advocate and all-around cool dude. So there's two things you need to know about this episode. One is that we recorded it in two separate sessions. I had to run an errand. He had to bathe his toddler. So we took a break and we met up another day. So there's this like sort of funky transition in the recording. You'll hear it, but there'll be music playing. But that's what happened there. So don't worry about it. It's not a mistake. But secondly, and much more importantly, something happened this week that feels very relevant to this very episode. David, you'll hear, talks about determining using DNA that he is the offspring, one of many, of Dr. Morris Wortman from Rochester, New York, which means that he and his family, David and his family, is very affected by fertility fraud. Well, a news headline caught my eye the other night. Dr. Wortman died this weekend in a plane crash. And there is a sensationalist side of me that feels like just, whoa, that's really wild. What happened? Crazy. And Twitter certainly has a lot to say about the headlines about a fertility fraud doctor crashing in a homemade airplane. However, I also want to acknowledge that this man really was someone's husband and father and many people's doctor, and a focus of a lot of very mixed emotions and experiences for a large group of siblings who have been working for a long time for justice and even admission. And now they'll never get it. So when I contacted David this week to check in with him about playing the episode, he said, yeah, of all the twists and turns of this experience, I really didn't see this one coming. But he also said to go forward with the episode. So here we are. It's Friday, June 2nd. I hope you get something out of it and that you understand why it felt important to offer this like extra layer of information. I'll be thinking about David this weekend and all his siblings as they grapple with this new plot twist in their story. Hello from 35,000 feet. This is Everything's Relative on an Airplane, a special podcast episode coming to you from seat 15D. This is a podcast about DNA discoveries. I'm Eve Sturgis, your host. If you don't know what I mean by DNA discoveries, that's okay. I think you'll figure it out really quick. By the end of this episode, if you still don't understand, that's okay. Just listen to another episode. After 2 episodes, if you're still feeling unsure, follow me on Instagram at Everything's Relative Podcast. And wow, if after all that you still don't understand, I don't know what to say, so call me. We'll talk about it. I am on an airplane right now. That's new and different for us. My husband Kaylin and I are headed back east for a wedding weekend, excited to see friends, and we're going to eat pizza, and we're going to sleep in without the kids. That's right. We came alone. Watch out, Brooklyn. We're going to be wild. Speaking of wild, one area of DNA discovery life I did not know that I would be a part of or learn all about is this world of fertility fraud. We've talked about it before here, but in case this is your first time with me, fertility fraud is when a doctor misrepresents his role in a fertility procedure. And that's kind of vague, and I just made it up right now. I don't know if there's a more official or thorough definition, but what we're talking about here on Everything's Relative is a doctor secretly and deceptively using his own sperm to impregnate a patient during fertility treatment. As DNA testing becomes more widely available, all these offspring are discovering this lie. They're discovering many, many siblings, uncovering unethical and nefarious methods used by doctors in the name of success rates, I guess. I guess that's why a doctor would do it. And to top it all off, they're discovering that this practice is not technically against the law in many states here in America. This is how I learned that if there isn't a law against something, even if it's deceptive, even if it's clearly unethical, there are no consequences. If you've been around here for a while, you've heard my session with Jessica Stavina. She was the first fertility fraud story I ever heard about. Her mom's fertility doctor is Dr. Kim McMorris. He's a fertility fraud doctor. He's still practicing in Texas, by the way. And then a few weeks ago, I talked to Jessica's half-sister, also a offspring of Dr. Kim McMorris. That's Eve Wiley, and she is an outspoken advocate for fertility regulation. She talks about working at the legislative level to get laws passed to make this illegal. And now, today, I'm going to talk with David Barry. He is the adult offspring of a Dr. Morris Wortman, a doctor working in New York, still practicing, ostensibly no longer using his own sperm. But who knows? Anyway, David had the unique experience of figuring out that his biological father was not the gamete donor that his parents had chose, but his mom's doctor. Sidebar, David and I talk about it briefly, but I don't linger on it. But I'm seeing this pattern of these doctors, and I think part of it is default of the profession. But they're also the doctors who deliver the babies. And there is something fascinating to me about the ego experience of a man who's using his own sperm and then also delivering those babies that he's pretending are not his. Fascinating. I'd love to get in the brains of these men and peel back some layers. Anyway, David and I talk a little about the complicated psychological layers of donor discovery, of parenthood, and how he's working to make changes alongside others like Eve Wiley. He's heading into Capitol buildings to talk directly with lawmakers. But I don't need to tell you all the things we talked about because you can just listen for yourself. So here's me and David Barry, hanging out, talking about fertility fraud. This is Everything's Relative. I'm Eve Sturgis. I'll be right back. Okay, so every time I point to you, you say something cool, okay? Hey, Dallas, do you want to make a podcast?
Yeah, sure.
Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money.
Wow, that's awesome.
All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters. And here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters.
I don't know how it works.
It's okay. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today.
Cool. Can we set it up now?
Yeah, and then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard.
Awesome.
Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch.
Wow, I'll download it right now.
Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, food tastes better, wine tastes sweeter, and I'm a better mother to Dallas. Isn't that true?
Yep.
I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
So for a little bit of context was I'm the product of fertility fraud.
Okay. Eve Wiley.
Yes.
It's all coming back to me. Okay.
There you go.
Yep.
So if you know Eve, you know me essentially. She's a huge part of a lot of parts of my story.
Are you related to Eve Wiley? Are you
No.
half siblings? Okay, so are you telling me there's more than one fertility fraud story out there?
It's great regret that I tell you the answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So all right. So tell me, when did you find out, and how? Can you tell me a little bit about your journey up to now?
Yeah. So I, like a lot of people, bought an Ancestry.com DNA test because it was on sale, and it was Christmas of 2016. I actually remember very vividly where I was, because it was funny. I was actually hearing a story from my sister's boyfriend at the time. It's her husband now. He was telling us a friend of his had ordered an ancestry test, and I'm from Rochester, New York. The town that we are from in particular has a great amount of pride around Italian American heritage. It's just a big deal. And this guy had an Italian family coat of arms tattooed on his.
Oh man,
yep.
It's always the ones with the tattoos.
It is. They're always the ones just asking for it, right?
Yep.
And the silver chains, the leather jackets, all the whole thing. And he discovered that he was in fact more Irish than Italian when this ancestry test came back. And given the context of where we were from, that might not be really funny, in a lot of other places, but it was hilarious to us as locals in this town called Greece, of all places.
Oh yeah, no, that's hilarious. Don't worry, I get it.
Yeah,
I know a lot.
So
but that's
So we had a good laugh at it, and I, in that moment, my whole family was there as well, and I remember saying to my dad, which ironically remains, still true to this day, that he does not know a lot about his father, or where the last name Barry, which is my last name, comes from. Now, it's not a super hard one to Google and figure that it's probably, Irish, British, but in a literal sense, didn't know where those ancestors or that lineage came from. And I was like, well, hey, Dad, I'm gonna order this test and see if we can find that out, where your dad is from. And for some context, my father's father, I guess my grandfather, passed away at the age of 41. He was a young man. And my father was young himself when his father passed, so never really had many memories of him or details to go on. So anyways, I'm drinking a bunch of wine and saying, I'm going to order this test. Test comes in the mail, spit in the vial, and the results come back. I kind of even forgot. Yes.
Question. When you said to your dad, hey, you don't know a lot, I'm going to order this test, it's on sale, did he hesitate? Did he blink?
Poker face was there.
All right. He's good at that. Okay. Mr. Barry's a stoic man.
He is. In fact, that is a very good descriptor of him before this event and certainly after. And yeah, there was nothing about that situation that made me think I was about to do something insane. I thought I was about to do something that, most Americans who get these things would do, which is, oh, this is interesting. I'm curious to find out. And so I think it was, 3 or so months passed. It was in March of 2017. I logged in just to see, oh yeah, I remember I took this thing and the results were there, and nothing stuck out in the sense where I was immediately hit with, a revelation. I know the Ancestry.com and 23andMe, probably all of them have changed a little bit, in the 6-ish years since then. But at the time, I did find two things that didn't really make a ton of sense for me. One was that I was 52% European Jewish. That did not make sense, because on my mom's side of the family, I knew with certainty that I was German and Dutch. But as I clicked on the rabbit's hole to kind of understand how you might be European Jewish, there was some qualities of, Germanic roots that I was like, okay, well, you start to rationalize it, right? Because when you get the results, you're not thinking.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And you're like, there were Jews in Germany.
Right,
I can remember one incredibly huge historical event about that. So
exactly. Yeah. There's something ringing a bell, right? So exactly. I did what I would have expected of myself in that moment, which was to begin to rationalize why that might be the case. The other thing that I saw that was a little bit harder to rationalize was I was unequivocally a high DNA match for a woman. She was my highest DNA match, more than one of my first cousins and one of my uncles on the website. And at the time, Ancestry would give you a series of options to consider that were, your DNA connection. In this case, it said she was either an aunt, a first cousin, or a half sibling. And again, you're going with what seems rational at that point. So I immediately say, well, half sibling doesn't make sense. An aunt probably doesn't make sense. A first cousin, that could make sense, because after having a conversation with her, she had revealed that she was the product of a sperm donor. And I thought to myself, well, I have an uncle who got out of the Marines in the early 80s.
Dude.
Bouncing around, right?
That'd be the end of this.
This is probably him. She and I exchanged a few emails, and I don't know if I was ignorant, naive, or choosing to be both. Probably the latter. In September of that year, so now we fast forward 6 months later, there's a lot of moving pieces here, so pause me if I go off the rails a little bit. My then girlfriend, now my wife, is adopted, as is her younger sister. Both of them are adopted from different families. They've always known that. My girlfriend's sister came over and had told us that she discovered through an ancestry test her biological half sister, and through her she discovered her biological father. And it was not a huge surprise because we always knew that those people likely existed in some capacity. But when she started to list some of the numbers from the ancestry results, saying, "Oh, I have 1,100 centimorgans in common with my half sister. That's how I knew that we were half sisters," the wheels immediately hit a screeching halt in my mind. And I'm thinking, I feel like I shared more DNA in common with this girl that I matched with than she has just matched with her half sister.
Alarm bells are ringing.
Yeah. So I'm listening, and off of one side of my body and the other, I'm opening my laptop and trying to pull up the results again. And I'm realizing again that this woman and I have 1,500 centimorgans in common. And I just feel that knot in my stomach. I'm still at this point not clear on what it is that I have discovered, but I know I have discovered somebody's secret. A week later, so mind you, all along I've been keeping my parents apprised of this. In retrospect, I know that they were hoping I would maybe drop it.
Oh man.
I didn't know, I was running headfirst into what I didn't know. A week later, this woman, and her name is Morgan, she and I uploaded our DNA data to a website called GEDmatch. And it has the ability to, for those listening who have not heard of it, the ability to do a number of things. It gets very granular into like your individual 23 strands of DNA, but it also will help you match potentially with people who are on different DNA sites. And at this point, we matched on Ancestry. Neither of us had been on 23andMe, but we found somebody who was an equal match for us, who was a user on 23andMe.
And is she a part of this conversation with you at this point? Are you guys?
So yes, Morgan and I had
becoming
been
friends in this mystery sleuthing thing of like.
I would say, between March and really May, over the course of 2 months, she and I exchanged, quite a few messages. And I thought, I had some ideas about who her biological father might be. She, in hindsight, had some different thoughts about how that might be. And, to no fault of either of ours, we ultimately just didn't communicate as often. But we definitely picked things back up in September when I had said, okay, I know that there's a secret here and I need to find out what it is. And when she and I discovered that there was another match to us, that there were 3 of us who shared enough DNA to be half siblings, I felt unwell because the things that I thought were possible was that either my father had donated sperm without ever telling my mother around the same time that I was born.
Oh, that's a good one. Okay.
Which was an option.
Sure.
Right. But you suspend, belief.
The things that you go with. Yeah.
Yep.
Totally.
And the other thing I was afraid of is that maybe my mother had either had an affair or used a sperm donor without my father's knowledge, for any number of reasons. I had known that my parents had struggled to conceive naturally, but that was really the extent of what I knew. I assumed some pretty hard to swallow things. And I'm, I guess, in some ways fortunate to say that the following day, after we discovered a match between the 2 of us, Morgan and I, we found a male who matched to us, who's chosen not to be involved, so I won't mention his name. My father called me and said, "I know you've been digging into this DNA stuff, and I need to let you know that you're not going to find what you're looking for." And the pause between that and the next line was maybe a second at most, but in my mind, it was rapid fire playing through all of these things that I had been considering over the past several months.
Isn't it amazing how many thoughts can go through your mind in a second on this earth? Yeah.
It was pretty surreal. And I just wanted to kind of push back somehow what I felt like he was about to say. And he told me that he's not my biological father, that I'm not his biological son, and that the very significant part of my my birth story that was left out for me was, yes, knowing my parents had struggled to conceive naturally, but that in order to start their family, my parents did use the help of a sperm donor. And that, as you can tell, I did everything I could, both logically and perhaps, subconsciously,
Right.
to not consider that option. And the irony of it is, when that happened, when I did hear the truth of it all, it made far more sense than I felt comfortable with, because I don't look like my father. My younger sister does, but oddly enough, she's also conceived through a donor. And it was just rationalizations, but I'm also not very much like him at all. I love my father and I have a great relationship with him, but we're different. And so there was that rational part of my mind, wrapping my head around it, but it was as emotional, I think, as, somebody would expect. I was a couple days before my, I think, 32nd or 33rd birthday. And, I don't know what the right time is to say, oh, I shouldn't be shell shocked by it. But I can tell you, at 32, it was a shell shock.
Yeah, that'll suck the breath right out of you.
It definitely did. And I thought that was going to be the big event, and maybe the
right. And that's the end of the story.
And that's the end of the story. And
the mystery.
Yeah.
Oh man.
And then
womp womp. And there was a sequel.
Womp womp and a plot twist. Exactly.
Yeah, sequel.
It started off great. There was some difficulty emotionally for my father in particular, and it felt like I was almost doing some reverse parenting. And I understood in that moment that I was still who I was, and my father and mother, I'm grateful, have been together almost 44 years, and they've raised me alongside my sister in everything that I could hope for. But I know that my father, the reason that he had dreaded this so much was he felt that my sister and I might look at him differently and feel that he was not our father. And I did everything I could to reassure him that nothing had really changed, even if it was an emotionally, significant event. But I know that took some time for him. That was probably the hardest part, was navigating that.
I relate to that wholly. I relate to that really, really personally. Yep.
Yeah, my heart still aches when I think about what he must have felt.
Yeah, it's tough to watch parents suffer. I think always, but to watch them go through an emotional thing, it is kind of reverse parenting.
Because you do, even as you get older, in a lot of ways, you still perceive, all right, so you recognize your parents are human at some point, but there's still an aura about them where they're just not going to be affected by the things that you're affected by on an emotional level. Yeah,
I agree. It's like a next level. Like, yes, of course I knew my parents were human, and I had gone through all sorts of like pedestal crumbling moments in my life. Right. But that one was and is still a struggle. Yeah.
Yeah. And it took time. It definitely took time. On the flip side, I was really delighted by the two people I discovered were my half siblings. In fact, we all ended up meeting each other, not because we'd gone out of our way to do it, but we were all going to actually end up in the same place at the same time 2 weeks later, and decided, like, okay, we should meet each other. And we did. And to this day, I have a wonderful relationship with both of them. And I would say the first seeds that were planted over that weekend, having spent with them, towards the fact that there might be something more at play with this, were planted as early as that weekend, even though none of us really realized it at first. And that was a simple, question of like, well, did your parents tell you, did you always know that you were donor conceived? What was their story? And as it turned out, both of them knew, from an early age that they were donor conceived. And they knew the story about the clinic that their mothers went to, the name of the doctor who their mothers had gone to for fertility treatment to get a sperm donation, and who also delivered them as newborns.
Same doctor.
And so I spoke.
Sorry, that's like that's I just, now that you're saying that, that's not the first time I've heard that. So that's a thing, is for like these fertility doctors to also sort of be their sort of fertility and OB/GYN practitioners, is what's going on, right?
Correct. Now, I didn't think, in speaking to my mother, as I did, after this conversation, that was not unusual for the time, or at least not at the time in Rochester, New York, where we were from. But I, was maybe a little surprised when she said, yeah, that's the same doctor who I went to, and the same doctor who delivered you. So, okay. All of a sudden, the three of us share this commonality, but again, in context, it didn't seem all that weird. Fast forward almost a year. It's just the three of us, and we've got this cool thing going, and my family has sort of, recovered, if you will, and there's harmony, so to speak. In fact, it was a day in August of 2018 that all three of our families got together for a barbecue, and it was, to this day, one of the most special nights of my entire life. To think that a year prior that something like that would have been in the cards was just inconceivable, and it was so special. The next morning, I get a text message from my half brother with Morgan and I in it. It's the three of us, saying there's another match, and it's this woman, this is her name, so on and so forth. And I was blindsided by that, because perhaps naively I had thought, oh, it's just the three of us. We've landed on this little island, and this is great. Morgan was asleep at the time. When she woke up, she started texting, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, and realized that this girl that she had, that we had learned that we were matched with, was in fact her childhood best friend, that they lived on the same street, and that she had a twin sister, that the three of them were the three closest friends growing up.
Goosebumps just went from like the top of my head to the bottom of my toes.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
The way I think of it in retrospect is, it was like surviving a serious earthquake, and everything's calm again, and then an aftershock comes that you're just not expecting.
Yeah, did not see that part coming.
I definitely did not, and frankly, I didn't have the personal connection to it the way that Morgan did.
Sure.
That one hit very, very close to home for her. That's when I started to think, and again, maybe slightly naive or wishing against what might be very logical. Occam's razor is that philosophical principle that the most logical explanation is usually the right one.
Right.
But I couldn't swallow much of any of that at the point. I really felt disoriented by that. I'll fast forward over over the next few months, there were a couple more. So at that point there were 5. Number 6 came into the picture. Number 7 was a middle school classmate of mine. We sat next to each other in Italian class because our dads are Italian.
What?
And except we're not.
I mean, Eve Wiley's story is so similar with in the small town feel of it, but like, this is the nightmare.
It got very close in the scenarios where you hear people say, well, what about, the incest concern, right? And they're saying, oh, well, how could that happen? Well, I am in a very living, proof that
anything. Yeah. I mean, it's just, never mind. You just said it.
Yep.
It just could have happened.
It could have happened. We'll fill in whatever blanks there are.
Yeah.
At that point, it became really, and I should also acknowledge at this point that we learned, all of our mothers had gone to the same fertility doctor. And when you started to have a sample set of us at this point, up to 7, looking at pictures of us at this point, having known what the doctor looked like, what started to feel like this is crazy type of scenario started to feel terrifyingly viable, that we resembled this guy and that all of our mothers had saw him. And at this point, between a small window of like 3 years.
Yeah. You're all the same age.
Yeah. And somewhere along the line, and it feels almost callous to gloss over the fact that the number eventually swells to 10, 11, 12 or whatever. I just couldn't. It was like a dog that gets something in his fangs and just won't let go. And that's just kind of how I felt about this whole situation, that I believed that this was a possibility, and I didn't want to leave it as an unanswered question. I felt like I owed it to myself, frankly, from a selfish perspective, but I also recognized there are so many of us, and probably even more that don't know that this is, true for them as well. And I needed to get a resolution to it. This is where Eve Wiley, comes into my story. So I had been keeping a blog about my experiences on a WordPress website, berrychronicles.com, if you want to go visit it.
Okay,
shameless plug.
Yeah, let's do it. Berry
Berry, yeah, like
okay.
the fruit.
Yeah.
And so I had started, posting things that frankly had been forms of therapy for me as I had been going through it, of just being able to get feelings that were a mess in my head onto paper where they started to make sense, or on digital paper, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And a writer from the New York Times was directed to my blog and reached out to me. At this point, I had started to acknowledge that I had suspicions about who my biological father might be without ever naming him, because I recognize obviously the weight of an accusation like that if I were wrong. And this reporter from the Times connected me to Eve, who was able to introduce me to a group called DNA Angels, and they're a wonderful group of women. For those listeners who hopefully are not going through the same thing, but if you are and you have questions, an excellent nonprofit organization that will do everything they can to help you solve these riddles, which is a gentle way of referring to them as riddles. They ultimately, so that I gave them access to my DNA results through Ancestry, and they were able to do some quick homework and said, ultimately, look, we can confirm that this doctor was a relative of yours 5 generations ago, but in the Jewish, communities, that's not super uncommon, with a lot of intermarrying in, first cousins, second cousins, and things like that. Historically, there's just too much missing data, and the only way you're really going to confirm if it is him is if you get one of his known children. In this case, a child that he, had with his wife and raised. To take a DNA test and be able to confirm if you're that child's half sibling, then it would confirm that he's your biological father. In my mind, I'm thinking, what sane person is going to pick up a phone call from me in the first place, let alone agree to take a DNA test that would confirm, what my suspicions are? And I believed so little in that being a possible outcome.
Yeah, I'm imagining this is when you guys all start strategizing how to get toothbrushes out of the garbage, or something. Like there's just no way. There's no way.
And we did. Oh yeah, we thought of having someone go to his office and picking up, an empty coffee cup, or
totally offering him a drink of water. And
exactly. Yeah. Well, much to my surprise, I made that phone call, and the daughter that I called picked up the phone. I was prepared to leave a voicemail. I was not prepared to have a conversation.
Yeah. What generation is she from? We don't answer the phone anymore.
What are you doing? I know. Well, as it happens, she and I are 2 weeks apart, which is interesting for a number of reasons as well. But she picked up my call, and I told her what I knew to be true. I would say that my dishonesty was perhaps of omission. I left out what I thought was possible, but what I told her in a literal sense was true, is that I believe we are perhaps at a minimum cousins of some sort, but I don't know for sure, and I would be able to confirm it if she was willing to take a DNA test. And to my surprise, she agreed to do that. And in a story of shocks and turns and stuff like that, which I know is common for guests on your show, and certainly for listeners, we hung up, and about 2 hours later I got a text message from her, and she said, I found your blog, which is the one I just referenced, where I've been writing at length about my suspicions without naming people, and I'm almost certain I know who your father is. And I got chills, because none of this was expected. I of all the ways I thought this was going to go, it was, in my mind, it was the complete opposite of how that happened. She and I agreed to FaceTime each other a little bit later on, and she acknowledged to me that she had suspicions dating back to her childhood about, not necessarily about this, but about her father potentially pushing ethical boundaries as a physician. And when she came across the blog and some of the the anecdotes that I had written, it clicked for her. And I can't speak for her, but it was obvious that the intuition that she had was really meaningful, to the point where she was willing to articulate her thoughts on what it could mean.
Whoa.
So we ultimately agree to, I send that test out in the mail and overnight it as quickly as I can get it to her. And she takes it. And of course, it's going to be several weeks before we can get those results in the mail. So it leaves this, 3-ish week window where we're just sort of suspended in air between, one cliff and another, twiddling our thumbs and all those sorts of things. I might as well just pack in this because I know this is another very unique situation, which is she asked me if I had any interest, like, what were my motivations behind this? And the reality was I'd thought about that as much as I could. And the reality was, at the time, my wife was pregnant with our first child. And I knew how much my life had been shaped over the past, couple of years by this event and not knowing. And sure, a lot of my motivations were purely selfish. I acknowledge I just wanted to know. But at the same time, I didn't want to have my son come into this world and hand him questions that were unanswered. I wanted to give him answers in a way that I didn't have them, to the point where when he learns, what's true one day, he's going to think it's so inconsequential that it doesn't ever matter to him. And that's exactly what I hope for. But she, in that, question, had said, well, are you trying to talk to him? Do you want to have a relationship with him? And I said, I think I'm interested in learning or understanding his motivations, but no, I have no desire, for a relationship. Well, she, of all people, was the one who encouraged me to reach out to him. So I did. I sent him an email. I didn't tell him the reason that I was reaching out. Instead, I gave him something similar to how I handled it with her that was true, but with an omission. The irony with this is my adopted wife was raised Jewish, and around the time that we became engaged is when I discovered that I had biologically Jewish roots, and that we were going to be raising, as I called it, in air quotes, a Jewish son together. And I, to this day, have a version of imposter syndrome as it relates to calling myself Jewish, because it's not as simple as the joke that began here of saying, oh, you're Italian, you're not Irish, go have some spaghetti, right? Those cliches could be, almost cute and charming, but the Jewish identity is wrapped in so many other nuances that I felt like an imposter, identifying in any way as Jewish and going on to raise a Jewish son. As it happens, this doctor, and I'll name him in a few seconds as it connects these dots, is a known outspoken voice in the Jewish community in the Rochester area, and he's well respected in those groups. And I felt like he would be an interesting person to seek advice from, or at least that was the card that I wanted to play. So that's the email that I wrote.
That's true. That's all true.
And it was true. A half hour later, my phone rings, and it's him. And I was caught off guard. I was expecting maybe an email response, but certainly not a quick phone call like that. And he was cordial. He was warm. He was gentle. But he did ask me in the early going, how did you get my information again? It wasn't an accusing type of question. It was a curious question. And I, as delicately as I could, explained, I recently learned, over the past couple of years that I was donor conceived, and that, my biological father is, Ashkenazi Jewish. And, as it happens, my mom used you as her fertility doctor, and you played a significant role in having my parents start their family. Recently, I have come to believe that role might have been more than, any of us originally thought. And I recognize what I'm about to suggest might feel like a wild accusation, but I believe you might be my biological father. And he paused for a beat and said, well, unfortunately, although the records from that time would have been, long lost to history, which is probably true to an extent. And I understand why you might reach that, conclusion, but there's a lot of, Ashkenazi Jewish doctors, who were in residency at that time, and, the University of Rochester, so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I can't be of more help with that. But, I encourage, I wish you luck on your journey to find that out. Now, I had sort of my proverbial fork in the road. I could have told him what I was about to find out, or I could carry on with the conversation and try to get what it is that I originally came for, which was maybe something that would provide context for an explanation as to his motivations, even if he wouldn't literally explain like, oh, this is why I did it. But something else occurred to me too, which is he did not deny it, that it was even a possibility. If I was a physician who had never used my sperm in place of a donor's to impregnate one of my patients, I would have said, no, I'm not your biological father because this act never happened. But he never said that.
That's amazing. I mean, like, there's like, I have to take a breath. I have not, like, I haven't been breathing for like 4 minutes.
Well, that was me on that phone call. I should clarify.
I can't, like, there's so much. There's so much because I'm like stunned.
So much.
I'm just stunned. I'm stunned. I mean, and I've heard so many of these stories and I continue to be stunned because, my question for this very second is, did you feel kind of like crushed or disappointed in who he was as a person when this weird twisted lie came out of his mouth?
No. Okay. I was expecting it.
Oh,
frankly,
okay. All right.
Because in my mind, he's not expecting, if I'm calling him with the question, that means I don't have the information to prove it. And he's a bright guy. There's not a scenario that I can imagine where he would willfully divulge that information unless he was forced to.
Which suggests that he knew that it was ethically fuzzy, bad, or wrong.
Thank you for saying so, because that is the same conclusion that I have arrived at, which is, why are none of these physicians willing to go on record, or a couple have, but ones who are long retired and, recognize there's no state laws coming after them. But if it's not a big deal and it's not an ethical violation, then why is it a secret for them still? Why not just acknowledge it? What ended up happening was something that, if I had none of the context I've just shared, that I would call a nice phone call. In all sincerity, I felt like he gave me some answers to the questions that I did have about fatherhood and Jewish identity and things like that. And it's, frankly, it's advice that, in a really twisted, ironic way, I do cherish, that I do consider at times, even today. He also told me, quite a bit about his family's history and where they came from and things like that. And when I hung up, the call, made me think, why would you tell me these things if you didn't think that I was right about what I was leveling at you? There was no reason for him to provide as much context about his own family and his own personal upbringing unless he was trying to tell me without telling me, essentially, who I came from or where I came from and what my roots were.
This is unreal.
And it was unreal. It was just one of those things where you hang up the call and it feels like everything else that you need to get through. In fact, I was at the gym at the time. Finishing my workout felt like the most inconsequential thing that I could imagine.
You're like, all right, 10 more reps.
Yeah, exactly.
This is crazy. Okay, so here's what's even crazier. I never do this. I want to stop now.
I just don't know exactly where we left off.
Don't worry. I listened to it before calling you. And so what had just happened was you were at the gym getting buff.
Yeah.
And you were just doing some reps, and then you talked to your biological father under the guise that you sort of wanted to know more about Judaism, and then you suggested that maybe he was your father.
Right.
And he didn't say absolutely not, that's impossible, but he also didn't say yes. He kind of gave a weird, vague answer.
Right.
And that is literally where we left off.
Okay. So
you finished up some reps.
And can I talk? I can say like, oh, I was so huge, like my muscles
Yeah,
were really
totally,
big. Yeah,
totally. Like it was like you could,
perfect.
yeah, we could see the veins bursting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
awesome. I'm sure that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what everyone will want to hear.
Totally.
Um,
I'm looking right now, David Barry, guys. Washboard abs. Washboard abs.
so yeah, after hanging up on this phone call with him, I sort of had this moment of disbelief that, like, did this really just happen? Not only all of the, the wild things that I had started to consider were possible, and a lot of the things I'd set in motion by getting his known daughter to agree to take a DNA test, but the fact that I'd actually spoken to him was pretty jarring. And so one moment you're focused on finishing your workout, and the next you're like, this feels really anticlimactic to go and just do another couple sets. And in fact, I don't think that I did. I think I tried and then realized it was a fruitless effort and I should just stop and go home.
Question.
Yeah.
Was it like I have a like there's a moment when I found out like my DNA discovery, and like for me in that moment, like I really did understand the experience of like the world sort of turning, and like sort of Alice in Wonderland feeling of looking through the looking glass and feeling disoriented. And did you feel that way before when you found out that possibly the doctor was your biological father? And did you feel it again now after this conversation? Was there a difference?
Weirdly enough, I think on paper, the thing that might have been most disorienting was the potential that my biological father was the doctor. But that's not how it actually happened to me, I think, because for a period of time, it became an increasingly weird possibility. And I had spent a lot of time weighing that before I got to a place where I was going to confirm it and ultimately, got the results. But prior to that, I think the reason that everything else seemed so big was because it came without any sort of preparation. The discovery that my dad wasn't my biological father was like a bomb dropped in my lap. And then the truly the most disorienting part of this whole process was a year after discovering or being told rather that that I was conceived through a sperm donor, and thinking for a year that I had two other half siblings, that it was just the three of us in a new tripod. And then discovering a year later that we had twin sisters was the most disorienting part for me, even though in the scheme of things, it seems a little small. But in that moment, it was just not, it was another thing that I wasn't expecting. And I think at this point, I've wisened up to the fact that I should expect everything. So I feel less caught off guard. But what I will say is the conversation left me in what I think is a place that I have spent a lot of time, which was this weird, almost purgatory space, which felt like there was warmth to the conversation I had with the doctor, but also a lot of resentment and frustration and just ambiguity around what I was supposed to feel. And I think I was just sort of like struck by that, and it was like being stuck around in a whirling type of topsy-turvy environment, I think, the way that you described it. But more than anything, I just felt more assured that I was doing the right thing by trying to get this answer. And the longer, in fact, I remember from the time I got in my car to leave the gym and the maybe 10 to 15 minutes it took me to get home, I became more and more confident that I had the answer, and that I had done the right thing. Because I'm thinking, man, if someone had called me and told me this was a possibility, I would have just said, no, no way. There's not a scenario where this might have happened. But that never happened. And it was the first time in a long time that I had started to feel like I wasn't on the border of losing my mind.
Right.
It felt like, okay, you're not crazy.
Right. So validating.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And then in a very literal sense, I want to say that it was maybe 2 weeks after that, I've got my timeline maybe a little bit messed up, was when the email test results showed up in my inbox. And his daughter and I had agreed to, his known social daughter and I had agreed that we would open the results together. So I would agree to share my screen with her. on my computer when I opened the email so that she would see it at the exact same time as I did. And the results, scanned to the bottom. Some of the language, to this day, I don't understand, but I did understand 99.9999% probable match.
I know that feeling.
Yep. And it was not as jarring. I've sort of already said this. It was not the jarring experience I expected. If anything, I felt sort of relieved, because part of me believed I would never figure this out, and that I would, a lot of people would go to their grave before I was ever going to get an answer to this. And so I felt relief. Number one, that I wasn't crazy. And number two, that at least as I could fathom at that point in time, that I had answered the questions that I had. And it didn't feel, it wasn't good relief, but it was relief of some sort, certainly.
How did his social daughter react with you?
I'm trying to picture that exact moment, but I think we both had that mixture of like a serious reaction, but almost like a nervous smirk sort of creeping onto our faces, which is
Chuckle.
yeah, when you just don't know what the right reaction is, that we sort of shared that. Another interesting experience, because you can sort of see that reaction on a face that looks like yours and animates the way that yours does. And it wasn't, and for me, I cannot speak for her.
You're right. I want to speak for you.
But for me, it was, not the mountaintop experience that I might have thought it would have been. But it was really validating to know I wasn't crazy. And I had a lot of gratitude toward her as well. I mean, I think we talked about this, a little bit earlier, but I don't know anyone else, a known social, child of one of these physicians who has volunteered, never mind it, agreed to, but actively volunteered to do this. I don't know of one.
Yeah.
And the courage, I feel like a lot of these are cliches, courage and bravery, right? But what I've, a lot of people say, oh, wow, I'm really proud of you for handling it the way you have. But like, I don't know that I had a choice. She did.
Right.
She had a choice.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I see bravery.
Pretty unbelievably generous from where I'm sitting. Yeah.
Yeah. Unequivocally. And then to, expedite the timeline a little bit more, my son was born a week and a half later.
Woo!
And yeah,
you're going through all sorts of life changes, and
all of it.
Existential realizations.
Exactly. Yeah, life's not happening fast enough. Let's put it on overdrive.
Totally. Let's take away sleep.
We don't need that.
Are you going through a lot? Let's just eliminate sleep from the variable.
Not necessary. Yeah. Put that on the shelf. It was one of the things that is going to be stuck with me, like a lot of this will always be stuck with me, but was the fact that he was in the room with me when I first held my son, and I didn't invite him there. And of course, I'm not saying he literally showed up to the hospital. I've never met him in person, but I couldn't escape the thought of him, because it was almost, again, to riddle us with cliches, I could feel my dad and my biological father, the doctor, there with me when I was holding my son, and not totally by accident. I had spent a lot of time thinking through that, that dynamic, if you will. If that in some ways I'm a product of the man who raised me. I'm certainly carrying traits and characteristics of the man whose DNA is in me, and my son is a product of all of that. And I'm sitting here and forgetting all of that. The miracle of childbirth has also just taken place, and I'm sitting there holding, my son for the very first time.
Wow.
It was one of the more singular emotional moments, I've had. I remember holding my son and staring at him in awe for all of 10 seconds before I just lost it, and just held him, close to my chest, and just sobbed and held on to him for dear life, because I was afraid I might drop him, which I did not. And I think
would have taken such a weird turn if you're like, and then I dropped my son.
Yeah. Now that would have really added some pizzazz to our story.
I didn't see that coming, David.
You didn't. Yeah. I've always want to kept you on your toes. One of the interesting things that I I also felt another degree of relief in a weird way, because I didn't like the feeling that he was in my mind in that moment. But I also, not like I was, I'm some sort of a martyr for having taken the bullet. But again, I mentioned this earlier. I hope this is never a weird thing for my son. I hope it's never a question of his. I hope it's just something he learns, he knows, and whatever, it's something he can file away, because, and this is something I've wrestled with, and because at a basic level, yeah, my parents lied to me. We'll call it a lie of omission for the most part. But ultimately withheld information, I'll say. And I understand why that they did. And I don't want to be one of those people who thinks they know everything because they have more information, 30 some odd years later than whoever it was did in the past. So,
right.
And there's no benefit in it either. I either have to choose to accept it and move on, or stay angry and, hold hot coal in my hand and I'm the only one getting burned. Right. So, and I don't harbor resentment toward my parents, but the reason I mention it is I hope it really is so inconsequential to my son, because I bothered to go through and, find all of that information. And I hope he's nonchalant about it. I really do. I hope he never even cares.
Right.
And I hope it's a gift for me to give to him that I hope he never sees as a gift. So, yeah.
He's like, oh, here comes my dad again with that story.
Yeah, exactly.
We know.
we got it,
the doctor.
Put it down. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but another wild card to his life that I don't have as much control over is my wife is adopted. So and she does not know anything about her biological family. So it's entirely possible at some other point that we might uncover those things, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But at least for what I can speak for. At least
you guys have walked the path before him.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? You're like, oh, DNA discovery? Hop on. Like, we got this.
Yep.
Yeah.
Get on the express.
Exactly.
They say there's no book for these things, but I think we're in the process of writing it.
Right.
Yeah. But it was a lot. It was a lot of big emotional events to pack into one at one time.
Well, congratulations on the birth of that son.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking about too, I've never thought about this, but I have never thought about the moment a man holds his son in the hospital room at birth, or at the newborn moment, and realizing, I don't even know how to describe what my brain is doing right now, but it's like unfolding, like the layers are coming out about recognizing the role your father who raised you's role was, and that he held you at birth, and the small difference of him having that exact same experience, except that knowing that baby you was not of his DNA, and whether that was consequential to him or not in that moment really trips me out for you. Like, it really trips me out for you in that moment.
It's interesting that you would say that, because it was from the very first time I had that conversation with my dad, the day that he told me that I was not his biological son, I understood his pain and his fear that, I wouldn't feel like he was my dad, but I never really understood it until the time I held my own son.
Yeah.
And, gun to his head, which in a literal sense I've never tried, but I have asked my father directly, did you ever think of me or look at me differently, with even just a little bit of an asterisk or a question mark or anything? And he's been unequivocal that the answer is no. And God bless him if he feels that way. I'm grateful that my son is also my biological son, but I don't feel romantic about it the way that maybe I would have once upon a time. But I thought about my dad a lot in that moment, and certainly in saying, okay, if someone had come in and tried to take this from me, or the fear that this could be taken from me, I understand that now. And that was in a weird, not a weird way. I think in a lot of ways, maybe that's the gift of a father. When you become one, you have a new appreciation for the one that you had. And yeah, it was an emotional blender at that time. And then I mean, not to abruptly put us on the next path of the story, but life resumes. There's, you know, some kind of, well, I won't call it normalcy, because at least for me personally, then there was, you know, parenting a newborn, and going through a bunch of stuff at work. But one of the things that I guess was not, you know, on my bingo card of expectations going into this was what I would do next. And I think I've acknowledged, you know, readily that a lot of my motivations throughout this entire process were selfish in some ways. I mean, yes, they had the potential to provide clarity to a lot of other people, but I wasn't necessarily doing it for them. I was considering them as a byproduct of what I was doing for me. And
that's very honest of you.
Because it doesn't do me any favors to pretend otherwise. I've developed a really, I guess, good relationship with the truth. And you know, frankly, that's another thing that I want to, you know, give to my son as well, is the truth. And I don't want to ever withhold things from him, you know, intentionally. I mean, if there's, you know, little things like, no, you've got to go inside because you've got to eat, and he doesn't want to, then, you know, I'll think of another reason to get him to come in. But when it comes to you know, substantive truths, I don't ever want to, you know, hide from that. But anyways, as that goes along, so when this all began, I guess, down the path of me trying to find out who my biological father was, I believe I had mentioned Eve Wiley had put me in contact with some folks from the DNA Angels. And also through that, there was a writer from the New York Times who had written about, you know, DNA discoveries in the area of fertility fraud, who had an interest in writing about my story in particular, because she had, I may be wrong in this, but I want to say she had either confirmed at the time 2 or 3 other physicians in Rochester, New York, who had donated, who had used their own sperm on their female patients. Yeah, donation my ass. Sorry. And
the
so,
heroes.
you know, for obvious, right, exactly. So for obvious reasons, Rochester being a medium-sized city, but not a huge one, the prevalence of that in one geographic footprint was story-worthy. So ended up being in the New York Times. A few weeks later, I was on Good Morning America, and that led to some visibility, which I jokingly call, like, you know, celebrity of like the lowest order, of being in this, you know, this small little corner of it. But anyways, it afforded me an opportunity to meet Kara from Right to Know, and some other folks who were doing some what I'll call activism, legislative type of work to not only be there and provide resources for people who are going through situations like this, or ones that are similar, or even just, you know, a late life discovery that you're adopted in, you know, with no other surprises other than the fact that you didn't know, I suppose. But there was also the, I guess, revelation or ongoing revelation that, you know, people are like, oh my gosh, well, so the doctor's probably in jail now, right? And he's lost his medical license, right? And I'm like, nope and nope. Did
you name the doctor?
In the article?
In the article? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. At that point, once I was able to confirm it, and I don't know if I've actually done that here, but his name is Dr. Morris Wortman, and he's been practicing for a long time in Rochester, New York, and I know has done a lot of good, and you know, has also done a lot of not so good, and that's, you know, it's a product of wrestling with this, which is how angry can you really be at the person who made your life possible. But I've learned also that 2 truths can be existing at the same time.
Right. Did he know you were going to go on TV and name him at that point? No. But you had the DNA proof that he was your father, so it wasn't slander or libel or whatever, all those.
Correct. Yeah. And frankly, the reputation of the news organizations would never have allowed, you know, something like that.
Right. Yeah. For you to just go on and just like talk about who might be your dad. Yeah, I figured, but I just was just imagining what his morning was like that day.
I can't imagine it was a great one. I mean, the last time he and I had ever spoke, which, you know, granted had not been all that long prior, he was not even of the mind that I, you know, knew who my biological father was. I suspect he didn't think I was going to find out. And so, yeah, it was probably an interesting morning for him, although I know that the the editors of the Times had reached out to him and his attorney for comment, and they declined. So, but yeah, it ended up providing me this, this opportunity to do something about it if I wanted to. And, I won't say that I, sought it out necessarily as much as it kind of, because it was presented to me as an option and felt like a good way to make something of, my experience, that it became sort of easy, right? Like they say, 90% of life is showing up, and really all I had to do was be a person with a weird story, who was willing to show up. And through that, since then, again, where I left off was, at least in New York State, that is one of, at this point, I want to say 38 or 39 states that do not have active fertility fraud legislation. They're working on it in New York. But yeah, when people are floored to understand that even today he's still practicing medicine and there's been no, licensure issues with him or anything like that, the legislation that's on the table, both in New York State and now at the federal level, is designed to address that head on. And, a lot of the legislators that I've had a chance to meet with on Capitol Hill in DC, which is a really disorienting and humbling experience, like all at the same time. I feel really fortunate to have, and look, I'm a government skeptic, like a lot of people probably are, that, the wheels of government move slow and they don't care about the average person. That might be true in a lot of things. I'm sure legislators themselves don't get all jazzed up and join politics because they want to talk about tax code. But I can tell, I believe, from a genuine place, that a lot of the members of the House of Representatives that we've met with on both the Republican and Democrat side have acknowledged to us that this is the type of thing that they get enthused about, because they can know that there's going to be an impact on real people and not hypothetical impact. And one of the things they articulated to, several of us who had gone there to meet with them and tell them our stories was, the law is an imperfect thing. And it's, at times, especially with technology, the way that it is in the DNA space and a lot of other areas now, is playing catch up for things that were never anticipated. There was not a scenario, I think, especially in an era of donor anonymity, that veil was ever going to be pierced. Well, it has been repeatedly by consumer DNA testing. And, one of the things that we had talked about a lot is the sanctity of a doctor's office should be just implicit, but especially for a woman who's going in, not just because she decided, on a Friday to go to visit her gynecologist. No, she is there because this is her last resort. It's not because, she's, out to have fun. She doesn't have other options. She wants to have a family. At this point, it's the, early 80s for a lot of us. She's there because she needs a solution, period. And at her most vulnerable, she has been lied to. And people will say, well, what if they didn't think what they were doing was ethically wrong? And, aren't you guys here anyway? And I'm like, if they didn't think it was ethically wrong, they would have no issue disclosing this as an option. And none of them did. Right. None of the doctors did. And certainly not when you multiply it by the number of, women that they've done this to, they didn't disclose it to any of them. So that, to me, anytime I'm wavering on, was this really so bad? No, they had an opportunity to disclose, or at least provide it as an option, and none of them did. So I hope that, that I'm there on the steps of Capitol Hill, and I have this vivid image, in my mind, which has been colored in a little bit more, having been there a couple of times to testify on this behalf of this legislation. But I hope I'm there, side by side with a lot of those like me and others not like me who've gone through this. But one of the ironies that we continue to come across is, I was in DC in January, so 2 months ago, and we had a roundtable with members of the House Ethics Committee, or I'm sorry, the House Judiciary Committee, and there were 6 of us, and we were just sort of struck by the fact that none of the people testifying were the first victims, meaning our mothers. It was all of their offspring. And one of the things that sort of put a little, Cheshire cat, grin on our face was the irony, the karmic irony, that the karma coming back to them is going to be in the form of the offspring that they created. And I know in a lot of ways, I acknowledge that I had some selfish motivations. I don't really feel like it's as easy to say that anymore.
Mhm.
I have, an opportunity for women like my mother, who I don't think ever would have spoken up for themselves,
Mhm.
and who have a really hard time articulating their greatest joy and their greatest, wrong, or wrong that was done to them. And I can completely understand why a woman like that would have a hard time, going to, to speak up and say, like, this thing that brought me my child or my children is a thing that I don't ever want to have happen again.
So
And
immensely complex.
it's that's
But
an understated word, and probably the
yeah,
best one
like
at the same time.
I'm really maybe putting myself in that place in my imagination for the first time as much as I can right now while you're talking. And I am like an outspoken, I can be crude, I can be, I'm not shy about my life, like there's lots I can talk about. But that's a new level. And to think about, when you said vulnerable, like there's nothing more vulnerable than these women coming in their last resort. The levels of vulnerability, you were talking emotional vulnerability, but then, and literally physical vulnerability, in the position,
I don't like doing this exercise, but I think, not too graphically, but I imagine like a woman in stirrups in a cold room,
yeah.
maybe alone, for moments of time, when the doctor or the PA is, outside of the room, or the nurse or whatever. In the case of our mothers, quite literally, because the doctors would go to the other room to retrieve the fresh donor,
And we
unbeknownst to
mean
them.
masturbate.
That's
Right?
exactly what was
Like,
happening.
so
And thank you, because that was one of the things that came up. Like, we want to find these euphemisms that make it feel safer and
right. What
more
keeps, yeah,
comfortable to say. No, there's a doctor who said he was going to, give you a live donor sperm. Instead, he looks at you naked, presumably, at least from the waist down, walks out into the room, looks at a porno, jerks off into a cup, and comes back in a state of arousal, and then inserts his semen into his patient.
so gross.
Right? So there's a lot of other ways to say that don't
Yeah,
come across as graphic and direct
totally.
as
No,
that,
I
but
think
that's
we have, I
exactly
think
what
we
it
have
is.
to keep doing that
Yeah.
because it
Because if you
takes,
don't, you minimize what has taken
yeah,
place. But that's what happened. That's what took place multiple times. And it sucks. And it's
yeah.
not easier to say. It's not easy to hear. And that's anytime which I don't question, the long road that may be required to see legislation passed. But if I ever do get to a place where I'm saying, oh, is it really worth it? Those types of anecdotes will help me, be reminded of,
Right.
it's not too soon. And how many others are there who, mothers who are ashamed to even address it with their own families?
Yeah.
Like, I think about that and I say, like, man, if all I have to do is just repeat something that has happened to me, I don't have to go do, new work or anything like that. I don't have to put together a presentation like I do for my clients. I just have to show up and tell people what happened. I can do that.
You can do that. Yeah. Amazing. So what are you working on? Like, what are you doing? Like, I want to say, like, right now, like, what are you doing? But so do you work specifically, yeah, what are you, well, I guess that's the question. What are you doing? What do you do?
So,
what are you doing right now these days?
yeah.
And
Well, so
and then also after that, I'll get into it, but let's talk about, don't let me forget. Let's talk about how can people learn more? Where
yeah,
should they
absolutely.
go? All that stuff.
Sure. So if I'm interpreting the question the right way, by day, I run an advertising agency, and we're having our 7th birthday in a few weeks. So 7 years in business, and that's my day job. But in terms of, what I'm doing now as it relates to the things that we've been talking about, and I will say this is, perhaps part of the second question as well, which is we are playing the long game of reaching out to more members of Congress and their legislative aides in particular, and showing them, number one, the language of the bill as it is, but also making a case for this is a good thing to be a part of. Number one, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's bipartisan and it feels good to put your name against this. And we are essentially, and I don't want to say we're the only ones, but as a core group of 6, if you will, who's been in Capitol Hill most recently, we are trying to reach out to either representatives from the state that we were, or specifically the districts that we were born in, but also the ones where we currently reside. For many of us, that's not the same place. So I live in Miami, Florida, and I was, born and raised in Rochester, New York. So I am fortunate to say that both of the legislators that I reached out to from my old home district and my current home district, Joe Morelli in Rochester, New York, and Maria Elvira Salazar in Miami, both of them took an opportunity to meet with me, and both have co-signed their name to legislation. I am incredibly grateful to both of them. But this is the part that always feels like Charlie Brown, where no one really hears the words of the teacher. But it can be as simple as saying, look, if you live in Ohio, if you live in, Illinois, wherever it is that you live, being able to say, I have a friend that this has happened to. There's this piece of legislation. This is the bill number, HR 451, by the way.
Don't worry, that's the title of Eve Wiley's episode, which kind of made a couple
there
weeks
you go.
ago. Yeah, like HR 451. Right. Is that what we're talking about?
So we'll continue to hammer on that. But yeah, frankly, that's the biggest thing is we're playing the long game because there's other legislative priorities, but we're also recognizing that the more names that we can get co-signed onto this bill, the better chance we have of getting in front of Jim Jordan, frankly, who's the House of the Senate, the House Judiciary Committee, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, who can ultimately determine the expeditiousness of this by bringing it to a vote. There are, to the best of my knowledge, 32 legislative co-sponsors on the bill today, which I think is, in my focus group of one opinion, a really strong number for something that was formally introduced less than 2 months ago. And
that's awesome.
It is, and the more momentum we can get around that, the better. And so that's a big focal point of one part of your answer, and then the other, as it relates again to what we're talking about, is like a lot of us who've been a part of this, we've probably written extensively about it. And I have a background in writing that was sort of my foray into advertising originally. And I started writing a memoir about my experiences, first as a method of therapy to take what didn't make sense in my brain to hopefully make sense when it came out on paper. And I finished it before I found out who my biological father was. And before
really?
I started, yeah.
Whoa. Okay.
Before I started, doing some legislative stuff. So I am in the process of rewriting that. But the title of this memoir that is not available for sale, but hopefully will be at some day in the future. There's, as somebody who has been an author, but there's the literary agent and querying process, which I'm familiar with and hoping to go back through. And the title is My Father's Son, True Story of Fertility Fraud, Identity, and Fatherhood. And it's my hope that that'll be on a bookshelf at someday in the near future. But
yeah, get it out.
That's what we're going for. Now I just got to find someone who wants to take a flyer on a stranger like me. I'm not famous, so that's a something working against any memoirist, I suppose. But yeah, that's what I'm up to.
Awesome. That's so great. So the best thing that people can do to help is to contact their local legislation, their state legislation in their districts. And
that's correct. In fact, even more specifically, I would say, look, there's a lot of people who may not even know the name of their representative in their district, but it's easy, type in into the Google machine, who's the representative for, insert name of city here. And in fact, to take it even a step further, would be to, look up the name of the legislative aide for that individual. So, in my case, here in Miami, if I wanted to know who the legislative aide was for Maria Elvira Salazar, type that in, find that person, and send them an email. I will say most of them are pretty good about responding within a few days. And if you don't hear from them, same as anything else, you follow up. I can assure you there are real people on the other side. It doesn't go into some sort of ghost inbox. And I think we've all been very pleasantly surprised by the support and yeah, it can be a simple request if you want. I can, leave my email address and for somebody to message me, and I can help walk them through it as well. But yeah, sending those emails, and if anybody lives in Ohio and lives near Jim Jordan's district, he in particular is a very important person in this process. So feel free to reach out to him as well. But
okay, did you hear that, Ohioans?
You guys are having a lot of rough times lately with your trains flying off the tracks and all that. So let's get you a win here. If you can help us along with this.
Easy win.
Right. Something to feel good about.
Yeah, right on. That's great. And I will make sure and have all that information. I will have it. It will be in the show notes of the podcast when this is playing. I will make sure and have a link to finding your representative. And awesome. I will have any other information you give me that's important as far as getting a hold of you or following more closely about what's going on with advocacy for legislation.
Cool. Go you.
Yeah. So well, and wait, okay, I'm sorry. One more question.
Mm-hmm.
Has anything happened between, like, what has happened to the doctor? Like, I mean, I know that he's not in jail, but
yeah, nothing. I mean, what's happened to him is his Google review has gotten worse.
I mean,
so
that's
credit
something. That's something.
It is something. It is something. So credit to and I'll give a lot of credit to Laura High, who is she's donor conceived, not through Fertility Fraud, thankfully, but she's a comedian and yep.
Yeah. I actually just sent her a link to schedule a thing with her.
Oh, there you go. You'll love her.
She's funny.
As it happens, she actually was a close friend of my first half sibling that I discovered. The two of them were good friends in college, and who would have known that they ended up sharing that in common. But she came with us to DC in January and did a lot of really funny TikTok videos that a lot of them went viral, and she got a lot of her followers to go in and start trashing the ratings of a lot of these doctors on Google who are still practicing, and whoops-a-daisy.
Awesome.
Sorry. But that's
hard when there are consequences to your actions.
That is something to consider next time. But yeah, to the extent of what's happened to him, that's kind of it.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting.
Bad Google ratings.
Was there anything I was supposed to ask you that I didn't ask you? Like, is there something you always talk about? That
I don't have like a catchphrase either, or like or a sign off.
Right.
And that's the way the cookie crumbles. No.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is gonna sound weird, but like you created an environment where this happened. Like the first wave of our conversation was substantive, I guess.
Yeah. Awesome.
So thank you for that.
Oh, this was great. This was my pleasure. It was so fun, even though it was not a fun story.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Fun is okay.
Okay. And you're like, what the?
This lady's nuts.
You're like, did I just have a different 2 hours than she had? And I get to see you next week, which is so cool.
I can't wait. It's gonna be awesome.
Everyone's gonna be like, what's up with you guys?
Oh, they're so cool. I want to hang out with them. I want to sit at their table.
Totally. Yeah.
I did get to be with Dave in real, regular life a week later at the Untangling Our Roots Summit in Louisville, and it was just as great as we hoped. I mean, I guess I can't speak for him, but I had a nice time. One highlight was sharing an Uber to the DNA Angels dinner together, and he showed me a picture of his adorable son. Well, that's it this week for this episode of Everything's Relative. If you felt moved even a little bit by this story of doctors masturbating willy-nilly for their patients, please contact your representative and ask them to learn about HR 451. I made it really easy by including links in the show notes. Wherever you're listening, you should be able to access that easily. And hey, while you're there on the podcast listening platform, would you review this podcast? Give it some stars, write a note. I think I'm going to do something new for the rest of the season. I'm going to read a review of the week. Today's review is by someone named Jane, and she wrote, "Important stories. I love this podcast. Well put together, compelling stories that need to be told." Thank you, Jane. Listeners, you too could be featured here as a review of the week. Is that cool? Write one. Everybody wins. Let me know. Find me on the socials, share the podcast with your friends, and come back soon. Thank you so much for listening to Everything's Relative. I appreciate all the ways you support me and this project. Give yourself a pat on the back. Smile at a stranger today. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Everything's Relative with Eve Sturgis is produced by Eve Sturgis and Kaylin Egan and edited by Joy Rumor. Logo designed by Ivy McNally, and music is used with permission from Goodbye the Band. Eve is a licensed psychotherapist, but her podcast episodes are not therapy sessions.
Okay, that was easy. I'm going to plug these guys in so the audio is better too. Is this on?
I can hear you, if that's what you mean.
You can hear me, but not through this.
Oh.
There we go. That's what we were looking for.
Whoa, you just got really deep into my head right now.
Oh. it is really disorienting, right? It feels like I'm talking like inside of, well, even my own body.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay. Yeah, I guess that's better.